Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Anya Prusa. Anya is a senior associate with the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. She joins us to discuss the topic of impact of COVID-19 on during the lockdown on gender-based violence. Anya, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
So, Anya, I don't want to take for granted the terminology, and I know gender-based violence is a little jargony and a little antiseptic, or actually, when you think about what it actually describes. Could you tell us what the term is used to describe what are all of the various problems that are captured under that umbrella?
Yes, so gender-based violence is, as you say, a catch-all term, if you will, that describes a number of different types of violence. And these types of violence are often interlocking. The most common that we usually think of would be sexual and physical violence. So when you think of domestic abuse, that's what you think of. But it can also be psychological, such as coercion or verbal abuse. It could be economic, for example, restricting a woman's access to financial resources or denying a girl access to education. And it's also important to think about institutional violence, or the structural subordination and discrimination that women face within societies.
I am not totally naive about this topic, but I will have to say, in preparing to speak with you and looking at some of the statistical data, this jumped out to me with such stunning, alarming clarity, that the most dangerous place for a woman to be on planet Earth is in her home.
Yes, so we know from data from the World Health Organization and other organizations as well that 1 in 4 women experiences domestic violence or intimate partner violence in her life. So it is a very real problem for many women around the world. This is not something in the abstract. This is something that women confront every single day.
So it's not much of a stretch to think that if people are trapped in their homes, this is not necessarily a good situation for those 1 in 4 women.
No, in fact, what we have seen already, even just over the last month, is that reports of violence are rising. And there are a couple reasons for this, John. One, we know that these sorts of crises, so global crises as well as economic hardship, uncertainty, these are correlated with rise in violence. So the incidence of violence, the cases of violence are rising. We also know, however, that some of these lockdown measures are making it much harder for women to get the services and the support that they need in response to violence. So it's really two-pronged, where the rate of violence is increasing, and it's also harder for governments and police forces to respond to that violence.
UN Women called it a shadow pandemic. And I wonder, you talk about access to resources or help, or even something as immediate as a 911 call. Was the situation handled before the pandemic, or were those deficiencies in place beforehand?
Certainly those deficiencies were in place. We've seen that violence against women, people tend to pay attention when a new report comes out or when there's a particularly horrific case that makes the news. But this problem is systemic, and it demands systemic responses. And that's something that governments have really struggled to do around the world. I obviously focus on Latin America and Brazil specifically, and you do see these breakdowns, right? Where many countries in Latin America have passed laws criminalizing domestic abuse, criminalizing femicide, which is the killing of a woman because of her gender. But these laws have not yet had the impact that we would hope to see on the ground. We are still seeing rates of violence and rates of femicide that are far too high. I mean, certainly no incident is acceptable, right?
Right.
But we're not seeing these numbers decline the way that we might want.
Why is that? Is it a lack of adequate enforcement, or is it the fact that we're talking about crimes of passion and people just aren't as intimidated by rules in these fits of rage or whatever it is that motivates them?
There's a number of factors at play. Part of it is that justice systems are often already overwhelmed. So if you're looking at say in Brazil, a woman experiences abuse, she reports it to the police. The next step would be for the police or the prosecutor to make a determination on whether or not she should seek a restraining order. And that has to go before a judge. And if there's a backlog, if the judge doesn't have time to see that case, or if you're looking at prosecuting a femicide, right, where a woman has been killed, again, if the judge doesn't have time, if the system is overwhelmed and that case is not seen, then that perpetrator remains free. So this is one of the big issues that we've seen in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. But there is also this broader social issue, right, where violence is to a certain degree accepted. For a long time, this has been seen as something that it happens. It's something between partners. It happens behind closed doors, and it hasn't really been talked about in a way where we're looking for solutions. We're seeing this as a real problem that needs to be addressed.
Are there cultures, particular countries or cultures that are more susceptible to that acceptance?
I think this is something worldwide that we need to confront, John. You could certainly get into the weeds where some cultures might lean towards one form of violence or the other. In Latin America, for example, we tend not to see forced marriage or genital mutilation. We see more domestic violence, femicide, gang-related killings.
Is there a sexist or sexism angle here, in that we're talking about crimes primarily committed against women, primarily committed by men, and many of these systems, elected officials, judges, whomever, are men. And I'm not trying to just make some sort of simplistic observation, but you mentioned cultural, societal factors that may be have implications for this. And I'm wondering, are there any studies or there's any evidence that if men were the victims, there might be more action in helping stop the crimes versus the fact that it's women who are the victims?
Well, I do think it's important to highlight just how widespread this is, right? So we know worldwide that 1/3 of women who are killed are actually killed by an intimate partner, right? So if you're looking at actual numbers, it is substantial. But what we have seen is that gender-based violence, and to a larger extent, women's issues, women's rights more broadly, are seen as being separate from the broader policy-making process. So this is one of the things that in recent years we're starting to see organizations like the World Bank incorporate more, is that when they're designing programs, when they're designing interventions, they're starting to look at it through a gender lens. They're starting to say, if we're trying to increase economic opportunities in a country, will that actually have an impact on gender-based violence? And this is critical because gender-based violence is not a niche issue. It's not something that's sitting off to the side, right? This is central to the lives and experiences of women around the world. And this is something that I think policymakers are just starting to understand. And we need much more of this. So when you're looking at the response to COVID, right, and the decision to lock down, obviously that was necessary. Social distancing is necessary from a public health perspective. But at the same time, the fact that we are seeing a rise in gender-based violence now, that was also predictable. We should have known that this was happening. Government should have known that this would happen, and they should have been prepared. And so I think going forward, we need to be looking at what are the policy implications for gender-based violence for women, and that needs to be incorporated in a much more central way within policymaking more broadly.
Thank you, Anya, for saving me from my semi-incoherent question with your eloquent answer. You got to the points I was trying to get to and failing to do. So let's look ahead now. You talk about things that need to be done, and you just previewed some of that. Who are the champions? Who are leading the charge? Are there countries who are farther down the tracks with policy responses? Are there best practices we could look to?
So I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot more attention to this issue. And I think actually, to make the best of a bad situation, because there is renewed interest right now, because of the reports that we're seeing, right, that gender-based violence is increasing, and that's not good. But what I hope will come from it is kind of a renewed drive, a renewed determination to tackle this issue. And I think there has been progress, right? So we have seen countries actually say femicide should be a crime. Domestic abuse is a crime, rape is a crime. And that is the first step, right? The next step is actually creating the policies that will allow these laws to be fully implemented on the ground so that women feel protected, they feel like if they come forward to report abuse, that their claims are going to be taken seriously. Looking at Brazil, right, which is the country I focus on, there are the beginnings of this, and I do think it is hopeful. There are specialized police task force that are charged with checking in on women who have reported domestic or intimate partner abuse, checking in periodically to make sure that they're okay. And not only does this help those women feel like the authorities are actually looking out for them, it also sends a message to everyone else in the community, to potential perpetrators and potential victims alike, that in those communities, if they report abuse to the police, that will be taken seriously, right? So that's a beginning. And I think you're seeing this elsewhere around the world. And some of this is coming from governments, like the police programs, and some of it is coming more from community activists. There's a program in India called the Red Dot program, where women who don't feel comfortable coming forward verbally, who maybe can't call into a hotline or are worried about maybe facing more abuse, if they do report, wear a red dot on their palm, a bindi, and that this signifies to their community that they are suffering violence. And the hope is that by raising awareness, then those community members can come together and help protect women who maybe feel like they will not be protected if they do come forward. So I think it's a combination of governments taking this seriously and being consistent so that women trust that if they do come forward, they will be protected. But it's also communities stepping up and raising awareness and saying, we are in this together, this is a serious problem, and it's not acceptable.
And speaking of stepping up and of creating awareness, could you tell us about the project that you're co-creating at the Wilson Center that's looking at this issue?
Yes. So I'm very pleased that the Wilson Center has decided this year to take a deeper look at gender-based violence, specifically in Latin America. And the project approaches this from a rule of law lens. So we're really concerned with access to justice for women who have suffered gender-based violence. And again, a large portion of that is domestic and intimate partner violence. But it also is looking at violence women suffer because of gang activity in El Salvador, for example, or Mexico. The project focuses on Mexico, El Salvador, and Brazil, which are three distinct countries within Latin America, very different experiences, but a lot of the trends are similar. And so our hope is that by examining the ways in which women have access to justice and the ways in which they do not, figuring out where those gaps are in the system across these countries, we can come up with some best practices to help governments, to help activists, to help women themselves improve the situation and reduce and prevent gender-based violence in Latin America. And hopefully these lessons will be applicable to the international community as well.
Well, Anya, it's hard to imagine any work that the center is doing that's more important than that work. So congratulations on the project. Thank you for joining us today and helping raise awareness about this most important issue.
Thank you, John. And if I could just add a plug for our program, if you're interested in knowing more, it's on wilsoncenter.org/gender-based violence.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anya. Thanks for joining us. Also to our viewers, thank you. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.